Welcome to Chapter 4. This chapter deals with the third issue of influence, and that is the issue of social proof. So social proof deals with this notion that we will do what other people are doing. And we've probably heard of this a lot in pop culture, is this idea that we are sheep that just blindly follow one another without really thinking about it. And for the most part, Cialdini starts off the chapter by talking about how this isn't necessarily a negative thing. In fact, this can be a very positive thing. When we are in a situation that we don't understand, we can look to other people for how to behave. And he gives you the kind of kitschy example of the laugh track on television and how most people find it to be annoying, yet it stood the test of time because research continues to find that, especially when scripts aren't written very well, that we use the laugh track. We use the laugh track as in that we will laugh along with it. In fact, there's a TV show called The Office that does not have a laugh track. And what's interesting is if you've ever watched that show with a group of people, is that people without the laugh track will start to laugh and they'll laugh even louder. And then if you're in the group, you start to laugh because they're laughing. It almost becomes the sense of contagion, yet it's really more of a learned response of, okay, they think this is funny, therefore I should also think this is funny. So even without the laugh track present, we still will adhere to the same notion of kind of when Rome, do as the Romans. If you've ever watched young children, they are kind of the quintessential example of this. I have a couple of nieces and nephews, and whenever we'll go to a park, if they don't know how to use, the equipment at the park, or the playground, they will look around to see how other kids are doing it. So a lot of times kids will be monkeying on it, as in walking up the slide backwards. And while my nieces who are old enough to do that might not have thought of it on their own, they're seeing other kids do that. And so they learn from that experience. And what they're really doing is falling trapped to this idea of social proof. Now that's not necessarily a negative thing. Well, maybe walking up the slide backwards is negative, but watching other people and engaging, for the most part, and mimicking their behavior is going to be successful for us. It's just that when we so blindly follow people without really thinking about what we're doing is when we turn into sheep, and hence the negative connotation. So companies do this all the time with little things, like they will, like a bar or a club will lead people outside in a line, because the idea is that everyone wants to get into that club. Even though there might be 5 people inside, it kind of sets the tone that everyone wants to go there, and therefore if everybody else wants to go there, so will you. There must be something worth going there for. Or tip jars. People will put money in a tip jar ahead of time, kind of saying, look, my job is worthy of a tip, therefore, please contribute. So those things might just be little subtle things. It can also be something positive. So the textbook talks about Bandura studies with regard to children and social learning as far as the fear of dogs go. And if they watched another child interact with a dog, they were less likely to fear that dog. But they did that also with film. So if I had a 5-year-old daughter who was afraid of dogs, she could simply watch a film of another 5-year-old playing with a dog, and she could overcome that fear. And that's really impactful in a very positive way. But it's also, running that risk of negative things, because if I'm watching something on television, or my 5-year-old's watching something on television that is aggressive, right, will they learn that as normal? And the idea is that the more frequently we see people behaving in action, the more likely we are to see it as normal, and then we are more likely to repeat that. And they even give you the example as fast food. If everyone around you is always eating fast food, well, again, when in Rome, do as the Romans, and you start to pick up on that bad habit and repeat that behavior because you view it as normal. So recognizing that we end up kind of falling trapped to this sheep-like behavior, and we need to be mindful of that. The textbook, this whole chapter, is just full of examples, and a lot of them probably pretty extreme to some of you if you haven't heard of them before, and you might have in other classes. He starts off with this idea of the presence of uncertainty in a situation, and he'll give you the Chicago cult example. And one of the researchers, or one of the actual cult members who was a research, was Fessinger. And Fessinger actually wrote a book called When Prophecy Fails, based on this situation. And if you've read the chapter, then you understand that this was a cult that was very small, about 30 people, that believed they were going to be picked up by spacecraft because the world was going to flood. And they didn't promote it. They weren't trying to save other people, right? They were just ready for this instance to occur. Then, of course, when it didn't happen, instead of, falling back and saying, okay, my beliefs were wrong, they actually believed even stronger, and they went out to the public to say that they now received another message that God had spared the world from this flood because these 30 people had believed so strongly in it. And they went public with that, trying to convince other people or spread the word. And so you would think that in the face of your proclamation or your prophecy failing, that people would lose faith or at least change their viewpoint. But as the textbook talked about, and if you get the chance to read the book When Prophecy Fails, there are numerous cultures, or sometimes we call them cults, across time that have had this happen. And in fact, it's not. I mean, yes, the Chicago cult, because of its size of only 30 people, eventually deteriorated, but immediately following, the midnight hour when the spaceships didn't arrive and 7 o'clock when the flood did not happen, they didn't lose faith, right? They actually found almost renewance in their faith. So that's where this idea of uncertainty, we don't want to face it. And so when faced with uncertainty, we are just more likely to follow the crowd. And so that brings up, an issue of changing people's behavior. And that cult example obviously is extreme, but they move you into other things such as the invention of the shopping cart. That people didn't know how to use it, and so the inventor actually hired people to push shopping carts around a store to demonstrate to people how they were used. And a more current example of this is when digital cameras came about. What happened was people kind of liked the film. They liked the click of the camera, and they weren't so sure about it. So what they did was Kodak was one of the first huge promoters of the digital camera. They had people on the streets of New York ask other tourists to take pictures of them. So I would be hired by Kodak, I would have a digital camera, and then I would ask, tourist A in the street to take a picture of me and my husband. And as they were using the camera, they got a hands-on interaction with it. And so therefore they gained interest. Wow, the picture was immediate, hence, ta-da. And now the spread of it, and again, the lack of film cameras. So that idea of being able to use this tool to one's advantage in promoting something could be a positive thing. So I don't want you to always think it goes to the extreme, which are what a lot of the examples are. An issue that comes up with uncertainty is what is known as pluralistic ignorance. And this is really this idea of that when we are present in a group, do we always follow other people? And why is sometimes group size going to change what we do? And the kind of quintessential example of this is the Kitty Genovese murder that took place in the 60s. And the idea was that 38 people witnessed Kitty being attacked and being murdered over somewhere around 30-minute time frame. And they did nothing, right? So they were watching their apartment windows as this attack was taking place. Some people could see her, some people could simply hear the attack, but nobody called the police. And their whole backlash was that, we are a cold society and we don't care about people. But what research ended up kind of finding was that the reason why these 38 people didn't call is because there were 38 people witnessing it, and they kind of saw that other people were looking out their window and not doing anything. And the sheer idea of having a large group of people present in an emergency situation has actually been found to be a deterrent, as in, I look around, you're not reacting to it, it looks like this man's having a heart attack, do I step up and do anything? Well, what if there's 10 other people around me and nobody else is doing anything? The idea of social proof is that I'm going to become a sheep, right? I'm going to go with the norm. I'm not going to put myself out there in the line in case I'm wrong, and I'm just going to do what other people are doing. So in the case of, an emergency situation, and again, sometimes it's because we don't know it's a real emergency, the idea is if you were in this situation as somebody who needed assistance, what Cialdini and researchers argue is that you need to directly pinpoint somebody. So if there were 5 people present and I thought I was having a heart attack, I need to say, hey, you in the red sweatshirt, call 911. And I need to specifically pinpoint somebody, and then I need to give a specific direct message. So they don't, they first of all will feel responsible because I've addressed them specifically, but then they also know exactly what action needs to be taken. So it's not just that I need help, I need 911. And so they were more likely to act. This idea is that you're just reducing the uncertainty for people. They know exactly how to behave. Another issue that comes up in social proof is this issue of similarity. So it's not just that we will follow other people when we don't know what the situation or how to behave in a situation. We will also follow other people if they are similar to us. Okay, so when in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, especially if I consider myself to be similar to a Roman, then I will behave in that fashion. So if people are like us, we do things like them. And you see this all the time. Right? We do this a lot with friend groups, with the cars we drive that might be similar to other people, the type of home we buy, the books we read, the vacations we go on, things we buy for our children. Right? We're all seeing what other people do. If you've ever gone shopping, right, gone to a store, people will look in other people's carts. Okay, what are other people buying? Right? Oh, she's a mom, I'm a mom. What does she have in her cart? What's she purchasing for her kid? Right? And it's kind of that idea that especially if I don't know, what kids like, then I can, use somebody else as a tool for that. For the most part, it sounds like, I'm sure a lot of you are sitting back and saying, no, I'm an independent thinker. I don't just follow what other people do. But remember, that's not a bad thing. I mean, when people call us sheep, they're using it as a negative connotation that we are blindly following other people. But there is, a difference in that we can converge our behavior. We're not necessarily always blindly following things, but we go back to that automatic response because it's easier. Right? If I see this woman shopping with 3 kids and I have 3 kids and she has, I don't know, a bunch of cheese in her cart, right? I might, go and buy cheese also because figuring, oh, it's on sale. And she brought that awareness to me, and that could be a good thing. That's kind of a simple example. But understanding that it doesn't always mean we're just like, I'm going to do what the other people do. I'm going to keep up with the Joneses, right? It's not necessarily saying that. There could be an automatic response that for the most part could be a good thing. It's just when it gets to an extreme case or potentially a dangerous situation, such as the suicide example, that, again, it can be more profound. So the textbook presents an issue called the Werther effect. And research is really interesting because it's really stood the test of time, as dated as it may seem if you're reading the dates in this. A lot of it took place in the 70s and 80s. It's really stood up against the research throughout time. And this deals with the issue between publicizing a crime or suicide and then what happens afterward. And what Phillips, the researcher who discovered this Werther effect, found is that following a public announcement of a suicide, as in a newspaper or on television, rates actually increase, but they don't increase in necessarily the traditional sense. So, for the sake of an example, if a 25-year-old man in Emmett County commits suicide by hanging himself, it doesn't necessarily mean that in the following days other 25-year-old men are also going to hang themselves. But what the Werther effect demonstrates is that in the following days, other similar aged men or people will be involved in more car accidents, right? Especially single car accidents, in the case that if the suicide was by themselves, hung themselves, then they're more likely to have people die in a single car accident. If there was, say, a publicized 25-year-old man who murdered his family and then committed suicide, there is an increase in multi-car or multi-fatality accidents, right? And this idea, right, kind of comes about that it almost, the publicizing of a suicide almost presents it as an option. And maybe an appropriate option for some people. And although they may not take their life in the very literal sense of it, that we traditionally think of as suicide, they may do so in another fashion, such as car accidents, or they even found research linking it to aviation or plane crashes. So this idea of kind of imitation or copycat crimes is quite common. The Werther effect deals specifically with the suicide, but they also talk about it in regard to crime rates. So if we see homicide or school shootings, it all of a sudden triggers something in us, as in, oh, this becomes an option. Now, I don't want you to think that every time that you see a negative message on the news or read in the newspaper that you are susceptible to then going out and committing that crime against yourself or against other people. But if you don't know that this option exists, you don't take that path. When the option becomes prevalent, right, or at least brought to your attention, all of a sudden it becomes an option in your life, especially if the people are viewed as similar to you. So if I see a lot of 30-year-old women right, who are committing suicide. I might see that as an option for me if I'm already kind of on that path. So I don't want you to feel like you're always trapped to it, but it's interesting how the links of this, and then what role does the media play in their responsibility for publicizing these type of messages. Another issue with similarity that comes up is the People's Temple cult. Okay, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably familiar with this, and a lot of attention was brought to the cult leader, Jim Jones, as being so charismatic he was able to convince over 900 people to commit suicide. But what social proof kind of works at is this idea of kind of being that sheep, following the masses, and why it worked so well is because he ended up isolating the cult members. So yes, clearly there were power in his charisma to recruit people into his cult. What he was very wise in a negative way about was that he was able to kind of convince a small sect of people, and those were the people who committed suicide first, and then people kind of follow suit. They looked around and everybody else was killing themselves, and so they did it. Not very many people actually escaped from that. There were very few survivors of it, and it wasn't forced on people to drink the Kool-Aid and die. So the idea that we kind of fall into this herd mentality and the notion of being a sheep, that's where it becomes negative. So how do we end up fighting this? How do we combat this? How do we not end up just blindly going through and just looking around and saying, okay, this is what other people are doing, I'm going to do that? Well, Cialdini says you really have to be consciously aware of what's going on and take note of things that seem really false. The chapter starts off talking about how a lot of times in product promotion, they don't sell us a specific product, they sell us in this idea that other people are using it. So an ad about, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, a shoe company called Skechers came out with these shoes that had like a balance ball in them, and they were supposed to make your butt look better, for the lack of a better phrase. And they actually ended up having to pull these ads because at the very bottom was a disclaimer that it was like 80% effective. These shoes will make your butt look better, 80% of people report it. But what happened was they actually only had a sample size of 10, and it's really small on the bottom. But if anybody who knows anything about statistics and sample sizing is that if you only talk to 10 people, right, it's not a very accurate finding. And you'll see that with, like, I think it's a Dentyne gum, potentially, that 4 to 5 dentists prefer Dentyne gum, or it could be a toothpaste. The idea is when you hear things like that, or when I recently saw a Burlington coat store where they have customers on there, and the very bottom it says, these real Burlington customers were paid for their time. It's things like that that should send a trigger to you of saying, wait a minute, am I just trusting this? 4 to 5 dentists, right? 80% of people say these shoes will make your butt look bigger. Burlington has great coats or other gifts, right? Can you really trust in that? And it's not just like, yeah, I see a lot of people kind of nod their heads with messages or products and say, okay, I'm going to do this, right? And they follow suit, and advertisers are very good at convincing you that you're like a group of people and the product will work for you. So it's really kind of snapping out of that and saying, no, I'm not going to fall trap to this. I'm not going to believe in this message. I'm going to make a conscious choice to not be a sheep, ultimately. But it does take practice with that. If something seems too good to be true, or if they're spouting, some high number, 95% of people do this, right? Or, success rate, be leery of things like that. Be mindful of, what you are consuming and why you are consuming it. So for this paper, for this chapter, what I'm going to have you do is actually find 2 current examples or events that fall trap to this idea of social proof, specifically the uncertainty and similarity aspects. So what I want you to do, and I give you the example and I type it out on the paper description, is find me 1 current example from 1992, present day, that deals with people falling trap to uncertainty, and then 1 current example that has people falling trap to similarity. And when I say people, sometimes it's obviously with similarity, it's going to be a small group, and uncertainty, this could be, globally. You could look at a current event. I give you an example of the 2008, stock market crash as an example of uncertainty, in that people didn't know what to do. They didn't know what was going on, and they just kind of blindly followed suit. People bailed out of the market, things crashed. We know what happened, right? Similarity, I give you the example of kind of this trend in eating organic. And when I say trend, I'm putting that in quotations because I don't think it's a negative thing, and trend tends to have a negative connotation with it, but recognizing that it started as through hippies, as like kind of the green movement, and then if you identify as a hippie, right, then you will kind of latch on to that. And how, if we find people to be similar to us, eating organic, we might also then eat organic. And it's why trends build, any type of trend. So I give you those examples. Obviously you can't use those, you can't use any in the book, but I just want you to come up with one example for uncertainty, one example for similarity, and explain to me why that example or event, right, fits in with that criteria. In this paper, you should not be using I. This should be written as, kind of an academic argumentative paper. Therefore, you don't have to say things like, I think this, you're the author, so of course you think that. Instead, just say, this is an example. And then, obviously, grammar is going to be graded for that. So that paper is due. It's so hard, I don't know what day you're watching this on. So that's your paper that's due. And the next assignment within the next, 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks, depending on when you're watching this, is going to be the midterm exam. Midterm exam is 28 multiple choice questions, each worth 2.5 points for a total of 70 points. You have 2 hours to complete it, so just make sure that you enter it before 10 p.m. because it's due by midnight if you want the full 2 hours for it. Also, make sure that you don't hit submit until you're ready. You can't move from different screens. It is open book, open note. These lectures, as stated, they're only available for 1 week, so hopefully you've been taking notes in them, but you are welcome to use your notes and books for that. And so I will see you back, I guess, depending on how many weeks it takes you or go by. I will see you back for the 4th principle of influence, chapter 5, which is on liking. So I will see you then. Good luck on the exam.